Hello guys, today we'll be covering a 2018 American horror film called Boarding School. Jacob is a 12-year-old boy living with his mother Isabel and stepfather Davis. He has nyctophobia, which means he has a fear of darkness, and as a result, he often gets nightmares. And every single time he gets one, he screams and cries. Isabel is really stressed out with Jacob's sleep terrors to the point that she can't stand them. The next morning, Isabel breaks the news of his grandmother's demise to Jacob. It turns out he never got to meet her while she was still alive. During the funeral, an old woman tells Jacob that he looks just like his grandmother Fega. She then tells him a story of Fega's valor in saving her in the past. Afterward, Isabel is left with her mother's belongings and she's contemplating what to do with all that stuff. Then Isabel and Davis leave for a movie date and Jacob is left with the stuff scattered all around the house. Later that evening, while watching the television alone, he puts on his grandmother's glove. But as soon as he hears his parents coming back, he puts the glove in his bag. That night, they have dinner plans with Davis's boss, Mr. Holcomb, and his family. This is where Jacob meets Christine for the first time. She's the daughter of Mr. Holcomb and is of the same age as him. The next day in the school, Jacob is bullied and teased for carrying a woman's glove, which results in a fight. Consequently, he's suspended for a week for his behavior, and for an entire week, he's to spend his time alone in the house while his parents are at work. After a few days, Jacob gets bored of reading comics and playing alone. So, to dawdle, he goes through his grandmother's stuff and tries on some of her clothes. Inside a coat, he finds old photographs which belong to his grandma, and eventually, he puts on his grandmother's dress and waltzes around the room. Unfortunately, at the same time, Davis comes home and finds him dancing in the dress. The very next day, they take him to Dr. Sherman, the principal and the only teacher of the boarding school which Jacob will be attending. The school is situated in the middle of the woods, and when they arrive, they're welcomed by Mrs. Sherman. She informs Jacob that he'll be sharing the room with a fellow student whose arrival has been delayed. In the middle of the night, Jacob sees a boy with a disfigured face in his room. He gets so terrified that he runs out of the room before the boy could explain himself. It turns out this boy is his new roommate, Phil. The next morning, he meets the other 5 classmates: Frederick, who suffers from Tourette syndrome, autistic Elwood, twins Lenny and Calvin, and Christine Holcomb, who he has previously met at dinner. After breakfast, Dr. Sherman explains to them the daily schedule that they're to stick with. When Christine tries to revolt, Dr. Sherman resorts to corporal punishment. He tells them that in 2 weeks, they will all strive for clarity. A day later, Christine shows Mrs. Sherman's driver's license to Jacob, which reveals her real name to be Lynn Adams. She tells him that Dr. and Mrs. Sherman are up to something odd and have been lying to them the whole time. Later that evening, when Phil and Jacob are in their room doing their assignments, they hear a thudding noise. To identify the source of the noise, Jacob goes out of his room and Phil follows them from behind. The other kids have also come out of their rooms. The noise appears to come from Frederick and Elwood's room. When they enter the room, they see Elwood covered in feces, banging his head against the wall, but there are no signs of Frederick. Immediately, Jacob helps him to the bathroom, but inside they see Frederick's half-naked body hanging. Christine uses this opportunity to convince Jacob to flee. However, they're soon discovered and are compelled to return back to school. They pretend that Jacob is the one who has brought back his escaping classmate, so Christine is the only one to face corporal punishment. The next day, Dr. Sherman reveals to Jacob that Christine has killed her own brother and is also responsible for causing her mother to commit suicide. Then he asks Jacob to look after his classmates so that they stay out of trouble. Thereafter, Jacob begins taking care of his fellow classmates, also maintaining peace among them. Then one night, Christine lures him to her bedroom where she confesses to killing Frederick to create a distraction to escape. She then threatened to kill Elwood if he does not get dressed in his grandmother's dress. After he puts on the dress, she forces him to dance with her. During their dance, she attempts to stab him with a pair of scissors but gets caught by him. He then lands quite a few punches on her face, which actually helps to reveal her masochistic character. She admits to falling in love with him from the first time she saw him. In the evening, Jacob sees Lynn secretively walking down the stairs, and later on he finds Elwood dead in his own room. He checks on the other boys as well, but fortunately, he finds them sleeping soundly. So he discreetly walks downstairs and eavesdrops on the conversation between Lynn and Dr. Sherman. From their conversation, he discovers that they plan to get rid of all the children that very night. While moving around the house secretly, he enters the basement and comes across 3 frozen corpses of the real Dr. Sherman, Mrs. Sherman, and Frederick. Just when Lynn arrives in the basement with Elwood's body, he makes his way up. Soon after, Elwood's mother, Mrs. Ramsey, comes up, while Jacob quickly hides inside the closet from where he could see Dr. Sherman and Mrs. Ramsey talking. Their conversation opens up the hidden secret behind the boarding school. It's revealed that it was the parents who have signed the contract with Dr. Sherman to get rid of their children. Just as Mrs. Ramsey was about to leave, the impatient Lynn cannot hold herself back and stabs Mrs. Ramsey to death. What Lynn didn't know is that Dr. Sherman had already spiked Mrs. Ramsey's drink with the indistinguishable drug that would have eventually killed her. Looking at Lynn's uncalled-for behavior, Dr. Sherman is not impressed at all, so he slit her throat and kills her then and there. And shortly after that, he looks straight at the closet and calls Jacob out and casually asks Jacob to help him to move Lynn's body. He even reveals his plan to make the whole situation look like the event of an accidental fire. Dr. Sherman does not even spare Claude's life and kills him too. Dr. Sherman tells Jacob about his contract-killing profession, in which he's been involved since he was a young boy, just like Jacob. Furthermore, Jacob comes to know that it's his stepfather who signed the contract so that he's never to come back home. At last, Jacob agrees to help him reposition the dead bodies all around the house. After Dr. Sherman starts the fire in the house, he hands over the key to Jacob and orders him to lock the students in their rooms. Nevertheless, Jacob does not fall for his trick. He knows that once he's upstairs, the doctor would set the stairs on fire, and in the end, he'd have to share the same fate as the others. Therefore, Jacob makes his first move and attacks Dr. Sherman until he's knocked down. Then he evacuates all his friends out of the house except for Christine. He locks her in the room to avenge Frederick's death and leaves her behind to die. As he walks out, he takes off his dress and joins his surviving friends. In the next scene, we see the kids being rescued by the officers and reuniting with their parents. Jacob keeps the secret to himself and does not reveal the evil intentions their parents harbor towards them. However, he does warn Phil's father not to hurt him, and soon after, Jacob also returns back home with his parents. That night after dinner, he goes to his room and turns off all the lights. He has a different vibe to him as he's finally overcome his fear of darkness. It's no longer the nightmare that he sees. In fact, all this time, he's been seeing the past through his grandmother's eyes. During the World War, people were forced to live in hiding and could not oppose the physical and sexual assaults done by the soldiers. Even in such an unfavorable situation, Vega displayed an act of bravery by killing the soldiers who used to rape the girls with the teeth she had sharpened using a nail file. Now Jacob wakes with blood in his mouth, and just at that moment comes the sharp shrill of his mother calling Davis's name repeatedly from the other side. It turns out Davis is dead, and it's Jacob who had spiked Davis's wine with the drug that he grabbed from the boarding school. After quickly throwing the bottle away, he looks into the mirror and smears the blood over his lips, and a satisfactory smile appears on his face.